This is Brad Keithley, Managing Director of Alaskans for Sustainable Budgets. Welcome to the weekly Top 3, the top 3 things on our mind here at Alaskans for Sustainable Budgets for the week of April 20th, 2026. The weekly Top 3 is a regular segment on The Michael Dukes Show. The show broadcasts on both Facebook Live and YouTube Live, as well as via streaming audio from the show's website, weekdays from 6 to 8 a.m. I join Michael weekly in the first hour of Tuesday's show from 6:10 to 7 a.m. for a discussion between the two of us about our 3 issues. We post the podcast of our discussion following the show on the Alaskans for Sustainable Budgets Facebook, YouTube, SoundCloud, Spotify, and Substack pages, also on the Alaskans for Sustainable Budgets website, as well as the project's page on national blog site, medium.com. You can find past episodes of the weekly Top 3 also at the same locations. Keep in mind that in addition to these podcasts, during the week, you can also follow and participate in the discussion with us of these and other issues affecting Alaska's fiscal and economic condition by following us on the Alaskans for Sustainable Budgets Facebook page and through our posts on Twitter. This week, our top 3 issues are these. First, we analyze where the FY26 and FY27 budgets currently stand, focusing on the revenue sources that are being used to support both. Second, we discuss the current status of the AKLNG project, including the potential impact of yesterday's presidential executive order invoking the Defense Production Act. And third, we discuss where the K-12 funding debate goes from here, particularly in light of the recent defeat of the 2 K-12 related bond propositions in this month's Anchorage municipal election. And now, let's join Michael.
Today, oh man, we start off with the big things. Where do we stand on the budget is going to be number one. Where are things? Where are we at, Brad? What is going on? Give us the bad news. Let's do it right now.
Well, Michael, a lot of the budget materials that the legislature comes up with, frankly, are meant to obfuscate what's really going on. When they talk about the largest revenue source is the earnings off the permanent fund, they're really obfuscating that there's 2 components of that. One is the statutory PO, the portion of the statutory POMV draw that's designated for the general fund, and PFD cuts are the other piece of that. And they don't divide the 2. They sort of just meld the 2 together, so you don't really see what's going on in terms of PFD cuts. Every so often, I do a chart that breaks the budget down differently than what you see from the legislature in order to sort of reveal, sort of look under the hood and look at what's going on with the budget. And I've done that this week for this week's program, and I'll talk about it in the Friday column. But it really is sort of revealing. So the chart, there's 2 sets of columns here. The set of columns on the left-hand side is for FY26 as we wind up FY26, and it reflects the latest revenue forecast from the Department of Revenue's spring revenue forecast. It reflects the supplemental spending that has gone through the legislature already and been signed by the governor. It will be fine-tuned as we end the year with additional revenues, or presumably additional revenues as oil prices stay high, and other things. But it's pretty much where the budget is. On the right-hand side is the FY27 budget that's still in process. And to build the FY27 budget, I take what the House has done on the operating budget. The House takes the lead on the operating budget, and I've taken what the House has passed and forwarded on to the Senate on the operating budget. And then I've taken the Senate's capital budget and added that on, at least the capital budget that's come out of Senate Finance that's headed to the Senate floor. And that'll be changed as the House reviews it and other things happen. And then I've taken the Senate's, what we anticipate to be the Senate's PFD, which is $1,000, and reflected the PFD cut that comes from that. On the in each set of the charts, on the left-hand side is the spending broken down, and on the right-hand side are the revenues supporting that spending broken down. And where the legislature really obfuscates things is on the revenue side and looking at what's going on the revenue side. So looking at FY26, for example, on the right-hand side, you see the dark bar at the bottom of the right-hand side of the right set of bars on the left-hand side, FY26. You see that dark bar at the bottom, and it says 990 million. That is oil royalties. And then on top of that, the slightly lighter blue bar is oil taxes. And then on top of that, the bluish bar, the light bluish bar, is other traditional revenues. On top of that is the portion of the POMV draw that's statutorily designated for the general fund. And then the red on top of that is the PFD cuts. Now, what the legislature will say when they say, oh, most of the budget's being paid for by draws from the permanent fund, by the POMV draw from the permanent fund, what they're really doing is they're combining the red bar and the yellow bar into one, because they don't want you to see what the PFD cut amount is. Right. But in this, in this presentation, I break the PFD cut out separately, and you can see that on FY26, the largest single source of revenue by far in terms of paying for the FY26 budget is PFD cuts. It's $1.66 billion in PFD cuts that are being used to provide revenue to the FY26 budget. Absent those PFD cuts, the revenues for FY26 would be $1.66 billion less, and we'd have a huge deficit. They're plugging that deficit. They're closing the deficit through the PFD cuts, and what I've identified on the graph as personal taxes, because that's essentially what PFD cuts are. They're taking money out of the pockets of Alaska families. On the right-hand side, we see what's going on with the FY29 budget, or the FY27 budget. And the FY27 budget shows something, when you do it this way, shows something that I think is you won't hear from anybody down in Juneau because they just don't focus on it this way. The FY27 budget shows that the PFD, the FY27 PFD would have been $300 million higher than the FY26 PFD. Right. But all of that $300 million is being cut and directed to support higher spending levels in the FY27 budget than you've got in the FY26 budget. And again, when you build up from the bottom on the FY27 budget, on the revenue side, we've got $1.03 billion in oil royalties, $850 million in production taxes. And look, production taxes are going down between the 2 years. Even though oil prices are projected to go up, production taxes are going down between FY26 and FY27. $850 million in other revenues, $1.37 billion in the portion of the permanent fund draw that's designated for, or the portion of the POMV draw that's designated for the general fund, and then $1.95 billion and nearly $2 billion in PFD cuts to support the budget. Again, absent the PFD cuts, you'd have that huge $2 billion deficit. And what they're doing, again, is taking $2 billion out of the PFD, personal taxes, using personal taxes to plug the deficit that otherwise would be in the budget. I think this way of looking at the budget, frankly, is a lot more honest than the way that Juneau and Senate Finance and Legislative Finance Division and others try to get you to look at it. It follows the statute, not only in terms of what the PFD is and what the PFD cuts are, but also in terms of the portion of the statute that talks about the amount of the POMV draw that's designated for the general fund. There's only, the statute says that we have a statutory POMV draw, and the statute says a portion of that's for the general fund, and it tells you how much, and a portion of that's for the PFD, and it tells you how much. And so what they try to do in Juneau is to obfuscate that breakdown between the two, so you don't see the amount of the PFD cuts that are being used to plug the hole in the budget.
Right, which again are personal taxes. I mean, that's the thing. The PFD cut is a tax, whether they want to call it a tax or anything else. It has the effect of a tax. It essentially is going to take nearly $2 billion out of the private economy and put it into government spending for next year, up from $1.66 billion to $1.96 billion. Almost $2 billion is going to be taken. That's money that they could have given back in some form or another to the people. They could have put into the private economy, but instead they decided to expand government spending by, roughly $400 million, something like that over the course of the whole thing.
Well, it goes from 5.81, so it's $160 million in increased spending between the 2 years. And if I did this back to 25 and 24, you'd see this creeping increase in spending, and you'd see the creeping increase in the PFD cuts. There's one other thing that I think is significant, and again, this is not something you've heard from Juneau, but when you look at FY26, the legislature passed a $460 million supplemental spending bill for all of the reasons that money got crammed in there. If you look at those bars on the left, before the supplemental spending, the budget was in surplus, and the level of PFD cuts that were being taken was unnecessary because we had excess revenue, largely driven by the increase in oil prices between the 2 years. We had excess money in the FY26 budget. And part of that supplemental could have been to increase the PFD, could have been to take a portion of that excess money and to distribute it back as a supplemental PFD. But neither the governor proposed nor did the legislature, when they enacted the supplemental, do that. They just consumed all of that surplus. Excuse me. They just consumed all of that surplus as additional supplemental spending.
All right, Brad, wrap up number one, then give us your final thoughts on the state of the budget as where it sits right now.
Well, the state of the budget is we're running huge deficits, and we're papering them over through PFD cuts, through personal taxes, and that papering over is increasing, at least between 26 and 27. Huge increase, $300 million increase in PFD cuts between the 2 years. Budget's growing, deficit's growing, and as a consequence of that, the personal taxes that the legislature is levying to cover those deficits are growing. You don't see that with what you get out of Juneau. This chart is a way to see what's going on in terms of the levels of government take.
Your assertion that, well, the legislature is just not putting it out this way. Jeremy Bynum begs to differ. He says, I appreciate Brad's work, but no one's trying to hide the $1.5 billion deficits being filled by reducing the PFD. Just watch the committees and the floor debates. And I'll let Brad respond to that. But my comment is, well, but Jeremy, nobody's breaking it out like Brad is showing it here. They talk about it in generalities. And they talk, and by the way, how many average Alaskans are going to sit down and watch the committees and floor debates? How many average Alaskans are going down through? You want a quick snapshot of what's going on with your government? Charts like this, I think, really help. But Brad, what do you think?
Oh, I've watched the committees and the floor debates, and I haven't seen anything that breaks out the POMV draw between the level of that's designated for general fund and the level that's designated for the PFD, and then the level of the PFD cut. All I see is people talking about and Ledge Finance when they present, and the committee members when they talk about it. All I see is a discussion of, well, our biggest revenue source is from the POMV draw. Thank you very much. And oil is second to that. And you sort of go on from there. I don't see this sort of breakdown. I mean, I've never heard anybody in Juneau, respectfully, Jeremy, I've never heard anybody in Juneau talk about the fact that the PFD cuts are the single largest source of revenue year in and year out that the legislature is relying on. And that's what this shows. I mean,
yeah,
you can go back years and years and years, and it shows that each year the PFD cuts are the single largest source of revenue the legislature's been relying on.
That's right. And again, a $1.95 billion tax on the private sector to fund government. For all you Republicans out there saying, well, we just don't want a tax. We don't want $1.95 billion in taxes that Alaskans are having to pay. Not just working Alaskans, their children, the elderly, the retired, everybody is paying it right now. So, I mean, again, I think this is a great way to look at it, Brad.
Well, and again, I mean, it's taxes that's just on Alaskans. Governor Dunleavy proposed a revision to the tax system that would spread the burden significantly to non-residents, that would take more than 30% of the burden off of Alaska families. That 1.95, instead of being 1.595, it'd be whatever 2/3 of that is. That would be on Alaska families. The other third would be paid by non-residents. Governor Dunleavy proposed a system like that. It got universally trashed in the House Finance Committee, including by Representative Bynum, in favor of keeping a tax system that takes money only from Alaska families. So this chart tells you, I mean, what I ought to do is compare what the results are under this chart to what the results would have been if we just used the governor's replacement tax system.
Well, there's your homework, Brad. There's your homework for next week. We can get it all to it. And then Bynum also said, Jeremy also said, the Senate added $88 million for the Capitol, expecting equal amount in the House as well. So, I mean, just more. I'm sorry. What would I say? Yeah. That's what we just needed to do there. So, Brad Keithley, Alaskans for Sustainable Budgets, the weekly top 3. We just got into number 1, which had to do with where we stand on the budget. The question is now, where do things stand on the LNG project? And somebody in the chat room, I think it was Rick, just asked, did he see the presidential executive order? Will it kick the pipeline in the butt? What's going on? So, Brad, where do we stand on this pipeline? I see Giesel is putting something else in right now because she wants to be queen of the world, and et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot going on. Give me the rundown here.
Well, it's actually hard to keep up with what's going on in LNG. I thought I sort of had it under control late last week, and I wrote the weekly column, and that was out of date by about 3 seconds after it got published. And yesterday, in Senate Resources introduced, or Senator Giesel introduced, a bill that combined 275. I think I have the numbers right. Senate Bill 275, which has been the vehicle that she's been working on to sort of increase control by the legislature over the project and to change the tax system, combine 275 into 280, which is the governor's proposed tax system, property tax system. And the explanation, the changed bill is now 30 pages long. And the explanation alone of what was going on in a slide deck was 12 pages. It was a 12-page slide deck explaining the changes that were being made in Senator Giesel's amendment. So it's constantly evolving. Over on the House side, the House Resources Committee is still hearing the bill and working on various provisions of it. Neither of those are yet out of the Resources Committee and headed on to the Finance Committee, where additional significant changes are usually made to bills. So we're entering the last 30 days of the session, but we are the LNG project is way behind in terms of the power curve. Don't let me forget the president's executive order from yesterday. I do want to discuss that in a moment, but I want to do one thing first before I get there. A couple of weeks ago, I threw up a slide that had been part of the Gaffney Klein presentation that had a bunch of numbers on it, and I was trying to describe how that slide showed how the economics work on the LNG project. And someone at the end of that discussion said, "Oh, a lot of numbers. Don't understand what it's saying." So I've been looking for a different way on how to talk about these numbers, and Gaffney Klein came up with a new slide last week that, or I think it was last week, that sort of does a better job of describing the economics around the project. This slide by Gaffney Klein shows in the lines shows LNG prices under two different approaches. One is the Japan import price. Japan publishes the LNG import price over time, and that's in the orange line. The blue line is the oil. LNG is sometimes priced on the basis of oil, the oil equivalent, because oil used to be, or oil is an alternate fuel for electric generation. And so the value of LNG in some of these countries and some of the Asian countries is as a substitute for oil. And so the LNG price is determined based upon a relationship to oil. And that's in the blue line. So the lines show the price of LNG. These are historical prices, show the price of LNG from 2016 through 2027, through most recently, well, it must be projected. Oh, yeah, it's because of the futures price. Historical price through 2026. And so you're seeing the price of LNG, the value of LNG in the Asian market on those lines. The bluish background, and so this chart tries to show how much what the economics are of the line with and without the property tax. It's trying to show the incremental impact of the property tax. And the bluish part is the part that shows the zone of profitability for the LNG project with the existing property tax. That is, when the line is in the bluish area, it is profitable. The LNG sales are profitable under the existing property tax. And then below the bluish line, or the bluish area, you see a line that goes horizontal across the chart, about at the $7.50 mark, maybe. And that shows the zone of profitability under the governor's alternative volumetric tax, property tax. So it shows the difference in the economics between the existing property tax and the governor's proposed alternative volumetric tax. And what you see is over the period that this line covers, over the period that the chart covers, that LNG is profitable sometimes under the existing property tax. It's profitable more times than that under the governor's alternative volumetric tax. But it also shows that LNG in the Asian market is not profitable even under the governor's alternative volumetric tax times, when the two lines are below the line, the horizontal line that goes across at about $7.50. So it's giving you a feel. What this does is give you a feel for the economics of the LNG project, something that I think we've lacked in the discussion for a long time, giving you a feel for the economics and the profitability of the line. The dash line out at the far right in the chart is using the futures price for LNG in the Japanese market, Japanese Korean market, what's called the JKM marker, the Japanese Korean marker, and is showing the futures price as a result of the Iran situation, and it shows those price levels at much higher than the historic price levels across the rest of the chart. What's basically going on, as best I can tell, in Senate Finance or in Senate Resources with Senator Giesel and others, is they're trying to figure out whether LNG is going to be profitable and at what level it's going to be profitable, and how much the state can take from the project through the property tax, how much the state can take from the project in order to allow the project to still be profitable, but barely profitable. In other words, how much of the overall revenues that the project is projected to produce, the state can take and leave the project profitable, but not with what I think Wielechowski and Giesel would term excess profitability. And it's a pretty good, I mean, as you listen to the House Resources discussion, the Senate, particularly the Senate Resources discussion, this chart's a pretty good tool to have in front of you to understand, the debate that's going on. Basically, Wielechowski and Giesel are saying we should have higher tax rates because there are periods of time, particularly the current period of time, when you look out at the dashed line to the right, what's going on with the Iranian situation. There are periods of time when LNG is going to be super profitable, what they would describe as well into the blue area. And so the state ought to be taking revenues during those periods. And so they and then they just sort of don't address the situation. The discussions haven't really addressed the situations where the lines are below, the periods where the lines are below not only the blue area, but indeed below the horizontal line that cuts across at 750, which is what the governor's alternative volumetric tax would be, the economics resulting from the governor's volumetric tax. So the debate that's going on is sort of this push-pull between the project saying we need to be profitable so that we can attract financing and show the financing folks that we're always going to have enough cash to be able to pay off the debt that we want them to issue. And the legislature saying, yeah, well, you're going to be super profitable sometimes, in our terms, super profitable sometimes. And we want to pull revenues from you during those periods. So you can sort of see the debate on this chart as is the push-pull between the Senate pushing for more and more, or the Senate Resources Committee pushing for more and more coming over to the state side in terms of the economics, the rent of prices in the blue area, and the project saying you're going to overdo it. You're going to take too much out.
Right.
The project would say, look, yes, there are periods where there's where there's revenues deep into the blue area, not excess revenues, but revenues deep into the blue area. Those help offset the periods where the prices are below the blue area and indeed below the horizontal area. And so don't take those periods of high prices, high revenues from us, because we need those to offset the periods of low revenues. We need to be able to tell the bank that, yes, we're going to get it covered on average over time. We'll build up surpluses during certain periods, and we'll use those to pay off when prices are down. The legislature, the Senate Resources, tends to be focusing just on the blue area and saying, well, look, you're in that blue area a long period of time, so we ought to be extracting some of that rent for ourselves.
Yeah, and it's more and more and more all the time. It's as much. In fact, Rob Meyer says, I don't think some care if it's profitable. Some have the attitude that it's not worth it if we can't take as much as we want. That's kind of the attitude right now. And we're down to the last minute and a half here. So how does the president's new executive order play into all this, Brad? Wrap it up.
So that's going to be an interesting play out. Essentially what the president has said is the Defense Production Act will now cover LNG projects, not specifically just Alaska, but LNG projects in general. The Defense Production Act is the successor to the War Powers Act that existed in the 1940s and was the authority under which the federal government built the Big Inch and the Little Inch oil lines that we've talked about on the program before. Right. And so the successor is the Defense Production Act, and essentially allows the executive branch to build pipelines if that's what it comes to, but to provide financial guarantees, much bigger financial guarantees than what's on the books right now, bigger financial guarantees, or indeed purchase the output from the LNG projects at a price that makes them economic, and then the federal government owns the output and can resell it. So it invokes a whole new layer of federal authority that hasn't been invoked to this point. Again, not specifically directed at Alaska, talks generally about LNG projects in general, but as applied to Alaska, it could be a game changer in terms of the role that the federal government is playing to bring this line forward.
Do you think it makes, I mean, is it too little too late, or is this just the shot in the arm that you think it needs to get it done?
It changes the dynamics. I mean, so the federal government could say, look, you're not going to build these lines. We're going to build the lines. The federal government's going to, just like the big inch and little inch during World War II. Or it could say, look, we're going to buy the output at $10.50. We will have a price guarantee of $10.50 for the output from this line. I'm not saying they're going to do that, but they could, by invoking the Defense Production Act, they could do that. And by providing that federal guarantee, that price support, they could make the project economic, because it's always going to have that price support as a way of covering the economics on the pipeline. So it's a potential game changer in a way that I think people are going to be thinking through over the next month or so. But it shifts the sand significantly underneath the federal sand, at least underneath this project.
Rick's got the comment of the day. Got a 74-year-old nurse running the show on a major project to move our state forward. Shake my damn head. I mean, she's just, she's just guaranteed to do it. Brian says, "Oh yay, the feds have entered the market. Be still, my faint heart." I mean, that's the thing. I mean, what do you, what does this do for the likelihood, Brad? Give me an over under now. I mean, we're gonna Kreskin it if we're gonna talk about it. I mean, as I've always said, I'm hopeful but not optimistic. Does this give me reason to raise my optimism a fraction or two, or what do you think in the long run here?
I would raise the optimism a fraction or two with the invocation of the Defense Production Act, or using the Defense Production Act to deal with this. The problem is it'll confuse things for a while. So if the state says, okay, the federal government can have a $10.50 price guarantee, great. Then it doesn't matter what our property taxes are, because they'll be economic. Our existing property tax base will be economic at $10.50 if that's what the price guarantee is. So it creates this dynamic, but potential dynamic between the federal government and the state government about trying to make the federal government trying to make the project economic, and the state government trying to grab more economic rent from a project that's now economic at a higher price. Ultimately, I think the federal government wins that competition. The Defense Production Act is an amazing thing. It's very seldom invoked, or it has been historically very seldom invoked, because it creates all these additional powers on the part of the federal government, sort of without regard to economics. And so, but it has all these provisions in it, and ultimately it allows the federal government essentially to override the state government. So when Big Inch and Little Inch were built, there was opposition to Big Inch and Little Inch, local opposition to Big Inch and Little Inch, because of the location and the construction and what it was going to take. And the Defense Production Act essentially allowed the federal government to say, we don't care. Forget eminent domain, forget state procedures. We're just going to build this thing. And did. And so it increases the powers of the federal government to help positively affect the economics. It's going to be interesting to see how the state responds to that. If the state says, well, if it's going to be economic at these higher prices, then great. We'll just have our full property tax. We won't need to have a concession on the property tax.
Right. They'll go back to Glenfarne and say, well, see, you don't really need this because the federal government's guaranteeing all this stuff. So you really don't need this to move forward. So go ahead. And I was wondering if this was what was going to happen. We've been ever since we talked about the Big Inch, Little Inch line and the dynamics of that. And I did a little reading on it, and I was like, wow. Because they built those lines, and then after the war, they sold them out to different companies, different private companies. And so if they get behind this, that takes the economic argument and throws a lot of it out the window, because it's guaranteed. If the federal government is going to pick up a component either of the construction cost or of the purchasing of the gas on the other end, one way or the other, it guarantees the whole thing. I'm a little more optimistic than I was yesterday.
Yeah, I mean, but you gotta look at the other side of the equation, right? I mean, it will increase the federal government's debt. It'll increase the federal government's the amount the federal government is putting into this project. so there's a downside from the federal budget, federal fiscal policy. And Congress also has to appropriate the money. Congress, I've read a little bit about the provisions of the One Big Beautiful Act that put a bunch of money in the Department of Energy that the Department of Energy could use for something like this. So the funding may not be as big an issue as sometimes people talk about with invoking the Defense Production
because it's already been appropriated and it's just sitting there, and he could spend it out on his own, essentially, as the chief executive. Yeah. And then, of course, we got something I was going to talk about this later in the show, but there's the whole de-dollarization going on right now of different things on the national or on the global stage, which could, I mean, we're teetering on the edge here of some really juicy bad stuff at some point. So we need to be paying attention to this. I mean, I'm more hopeful, but at the same time, does it accelerate the potential crash in the future? That's the biggest question.
Well, it will make you. I mean, we've talked about since the beginning, since we talked about Big Inch, Little Inch, about the federal government. You know, the question is this project ever going to be economic? Well, the federal government could come in and do it, and invoking, creating the ability to use the Defense Production Act sort of is a precursor to the federal government coming in and doing it.
Right. Exactly. All right. 30 seconds. Final thoughts on this, Brad, before we go.
It's hard to watch the LNG debate because it keeps shifting, but I think this chart is a very useful tool to keep in mind what the economics are that people are debating as they go through it. It's not perfect because it's a backward-looking chart. It's not a forward-looking price chart, but it's a good tool to see really the economics that people are debating.
All right, Brad Keith, the Alaskans for Sustainable Budgets, the weekly top 3. We're on to number 3 for today, Brad. Is the K-12 community understanding the wake-up call, or will they just shift to more funding?
Yeah, so the Anchorage vote that defeated the 2 school bonds is an interesting dynamic. It's creating an interesting dynamic about where we're going on K through 12 funding in the state, and that's picked up. It was picked up particularly in an editorial this weekend in the ADN, the Binkley Family Blog, which you wouldn't expect to say what this editorial says. The headline is "Anchorage schools are shrinking. It's time to face it." And basically, it's a discussion that says we sort of reached the outer limits of what, at least in Anchorage, voters are willing to do with respect to schools. We've sort of reached the end of their willingness to continually increase funding, continually increase property taxes, pass bonds to support schools. And so what does that mean? The editorial sort of addresses what that means or thinks about what that means, and basically says, look, schools are shrinking. The school age population is shrinking. We need to recognize that, and we need to start redoing things or thinking about things in an environment where, you know, we've sort of hit the edge of what people are willing to fund. We've sort of hit the edge in terms of school population as it starts falling back, and we need to think about K through 12 in a different way than we've thought about it before, and talk specifically about Mississippi, about the Mississippi approach and how Mississippi has elevated itself from being worst, if not worst, near worst in terms of school output, to one of the best in terms of educational output in the nation. Significantly increase itself. So it talks about Mississippi as a way of looking at an alternative way. Right. And so I think it's a useful, I mean, the election results and the way that the ADN is reflecting on it is sort of a useful tool to say, okay, we've sort of hit the outer boundary of what voters are going to be willing to do in terms of funding K through 12. And we need to start shrinking back. We need to start thinking about what that means and the different environment that we need to develop going forward as we go forward in in this new environment of sort of having hit the outer limits. At the same time that the ADN has that editorial, there's another op-ed written by a parent, Kara Sobel, that talks about the school bond failure. And the headline of it is a school bond failure in more ways than one. And it sort of bemoans the fact that voters voted down the school bonds, attributes the reason for it to some degree to the less than perfect press that the schools are getting right now in terms of their output, in terms of in a lot of different ways. And then rather than like the ADN editorial, which says, okay, we've sort of hit the outer limits. Now we need to start thinking about what that means and start thinking about redeploying assets. The parent editorial, Kara Sorbel's editorial, says, well, we just need to go get more money from the state. If local voters aren't going to vote any more money for K through 12, we still need more money for K through 12. And so we need to increase the pressure on the state, which after all is where the money ought to come from. Alaska, I mean, notwithstanding the fact Alaska is a true outlier in terms of how much of funding for schools comes from the state versus local.
Right.
The editorial says we need to push the state for more funding.
Right. And how much we spend per pupil already on top of it. I read both of these articles, and quite honestly, the one from the parent is very much pie in the sky, very much entitlement based. This is what we need, and the state should pay for it. Whereas I was shocked that the editorial from the ADN was basically like acknowledging that, look, the shrink is here. They call it the big shrink. That's a national thing. It's not just an Alaska thing. The big shrink is here. We've had a decreasing population, lower birth rate, fewer students, more choice. People are leaving brick and mortar. And so we've got to acknowledge the reality that there are less students, 7,500 less students in 10 years. I mean, that's a significant number. You just don't, 7,500 empty seats in these schools. You don't just leave all the schools open. And that's what they're finally acknowledging.
Yeah. And so I think I think the Anchorage election, in a lot of different industries, in a lot of different ways, you can pinpoint when the point at which we went too far. We spent too much. We taxed too much. We built too much. I remember when Dallas sort of hit in the mid 70s, sort of hit peak building. And you could see these half completed buildings where the money ran out. And so you see these industries where you hit the edge and you start coming back and you start re-envisioning what you ought to be doing going forward, because you're not going to be able to continue going in that direction anymore. And I think the Anchorage election, the defeat of the bond issues, is sort of that point. And I think the ADN is correct in pointing that out, that's the point at which we need to now start rethinking about what we're doing going forward. But that's not going to be universal. I mean, parents are going to continue to say, oh, it's the state after all. State ought to pay for all this. And so we need to keep pushing on the state. I think the test is going to be whether the legislature and the state as a whole sees the Anchorage vote as a lesson that ought to be applied at the state level as well, and say, look, if parents in Anchorage aren't going to vote for more, then we need to rethink what we're doing down here as well.
Yeah, and I don't know if that lesson is being heard or not, but I think, again, between this, the $10 million vote in Fairbanks 2 years ago, 18 months ago, whatever it was, May, I guess it'd be 2 years ago now, where they wanted to vote $10 million over the tax cap to fix schools, the same thing. In Fairbanks, which is pretty blue at this point, and they voted no on it. I think you're starting to see that max headroom area where people are like, yeah, we can't go any further than this. Even though they support education, they can't see any more taxes going to it. And I think maybe it calls a woe back. We got 45 seconds here, Brent.
Yeah, I think even though they support education, I think that mindset, I think what the ADN is saying is we ought to apply that mindset. We support education, but we need to re-envision it. I think that's the mindset that as a state we need, as Anchorage is going to, and I think as a state we need to be working toward now as well.
In reading these two editorials, I mean, you're it's very much the entitled. I mean, her name's not Karen, it's Kara, but it's very much that idea of it's. I mean, really, I mean, I don't mean to be mean, but seriously, isn't that really what's going on? It just seems like this is what we deserve and this is what we need, and the state is our daddy, and the state should give us everything. I mean, not acknowledging at all the fact that they've lost 7,000 students, 7,500 students since 2010. And you just, again, if each average school only holds 300, 400 students, I mean, that's a lot of schools that you got empty seats in them, right? If you're looking at it like that. We've been talking about that on this program for months now, that you can't just lose all those students and expect to do business exactly the same way, not just on an attendance level, but also on the fact that you're getting funding on a per pupil level. You just can't continue that.
Yeah, and I think all those arguments we've been having on the show, all those discussions that we've been having on the show and elsewhere, I think what the Anchorage vote is a validation of that, in the sense that, yeah, there are all these problems and we can't keep throwing money at it. It's not, we are not supporting, the Anchorage voters do not support continuing to throw money at that. The parent editorial, Kara's editorial was a lot more, well, that's because of the peculiarities of Anchorage and the failures of the Anchorage school board and the failure of Anchorage in general. That doesn't mean education doesn't need less money. It just means that Anchorage, that nobody likes Anchorage or nobody trusts Anchorage anymore. So we just need to get the money a different way. And I don't think that works. I don't think that argument works. So all the pushback that you and others have been having on, we can't keep throwing money at the problem. Throwing money at the problem is not the solution. All that pushback, I think, has now been validated by the voters in Anchorage saying, we don't support more money. And I think that should be taken by not only by Anchorage, but also by the legislature, because after all, Anchorage is 50% of the state, by the legislature, and saying, maybe throwing more money at this stuff isn't the right solution. Maybe we need to be re-envisioning, like the ADN editorial says, maybe we need to be re-envisioning where we go with this. And I think that's sort of the next step, to have people at the state level start picking up on that and saying, that's the Anchorage voters push back on it. We need to start pushing back on it as well at the state level.
Well, I would hope so, but you can never count on the stupidity of that going on. And then we have, this is a throwback to our earlier discussions in the hour. Teresa said, our outgoing senator, she's talking about Senator Stevens, and our rep, Louise Stutes, at a recent trade show forum scolded us for wanting a full PFD. And then they prophesied an income tax if we got one. If we got a full PFD, we'd have an income. We've already got the PFD. They're already taking it. I mean, I don't understand the whole thing here.
What's really fascinating to me is either a sales tax or an income tax, a flat income tax, even not a progressive income tax, but a flat income tax, would take less from 80% of Alaska families than PFD cuts are. I mean, I've done that chart over and over and over and over again in the Friday column, and run those numbers over and over and over again. Middle and lower income Alaska families, 80% of Alaska families end up with more in their pockets, even after taking into account the federal income tax effect, end up with more in their pockets with a sales tax, broad-based sales tax, or a broad-based income tax, in large part because you're pushing a big share of the burden off on non-residents. And so you're reducing the share that has to come from the state residents, and you're flattening it out in a way that improves the distributional effects on middle and lower income Alaska families. So when Stutes says, or Stevens says, or somebody says, oh, you'd have to pay an income tax, 80% of Alaska families ought to say, great. because
We'd
I
be
would
better
pay
off.
less
Yeah.
in that situation than with PFD cuts.
But they're counting on the tax aversion. That's what they're counting on. They're counting on all those people who are so tax adverse that they don't see that the PFD is a tax, and they don't factor it that way. They're the Randys of the world. They don't. Oh, it can't possibly be a tax, and so any other tax is bad. Not that any other option would be less money out of your pocket in the long run. Yeah, give me a full PFD and give me a tax. I'd take that because I know that I'd have 30% more money at the end of the year. That's where we're at right now. But again, they're counting on the tax aversion to scare people into not doing it, and that's where we're at right now. 40 seconds, Brad. Final thoughts.
Well, they're also concerned. They're also not only they're also counting on that, but they're also counting on the fact that people would say, "Oh my gosh, if we had to pay taxes, people would be pushing back on spending more." And so we wouldn't have all these programs that we can have out there. And they're counting on all the special interests who are dependent on these programs to keep pushing them.
That's true. That's true too, as well. So the growing comment is, I'm just grateful for whatever we get, says Rob. That's the growing comment on the PFD. I'm just grateful for whatever. It's your money. It's $4,000 a year per person in your household of your money that's being taken. Oh man. Brad, hey, thanks, man. I appreciate it. It was good. We look forward to next week. All right. We'll catch you next time.
Thank you very much, Michael. See you next week. Well, that's a wrap for another week's edition of the weekly top 3 from Alaskans for Sustainable Budgets. Thank you again for joining us. Remember that you can find past episodes on our YouTube, SoundCloud, Spotify, and Substack pages, and keep track of us during the week on Facebook and Twitter. This has been Brad Keithley, Managing Director of Alaskans for Sustainable Budgets. We look forward to you joining us again next week on the next edition of the Weekly Top 3.